Alrighty, in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to put together a skeleton JavaScript application that's not going to do anything yet. So basically, I want to talk about all the different module loaders, but I don't want to have to go through building the sample application every single time when we go and actually integrate our module loader into this. So this video, we're just going to be writing a bunch of JavaScript and maybe some less as well to style things a little bit, and it'll be super exciting. Now, I did decide to go ahead and I will have this available for download if you want to start off with this already written to where we'll have in this video, and then you'll be able to add on the additional module loaders yourself in the later videos. But if you just want to hang out for a little bit and hear some commentary about some different features and see a couple more ways we can use the import-export syntax, then let's go ahead and get started. I do recommend people at least watch this video so you have an idea of what this application does and you get a general idea of how we're going to load some things. But yeah, let's go ahead and pop open source. Just a side note, I do have my watch task open, so it will be compiling things as we move along. Now, inside of source, we'll start off by defining our user class. So my user class is basically just going to be a read-only property bag of certain values. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define symbols for each one of our private fields. So I'm going to say const first equals symbol first, last equals symbol last, and ID equals symbol ID. So it's really cool here that that we can define these little private symbols, and they're not going to be accessible from any other module because we're not exporting them, and that is a good thing. Next up, let's create our read-only properties. So getID is simply going to be return this at ID. GetFirst is going to be simply return this at first, and getLast will simply be return this at last. Then we'll do our constructor, which, not surprisingly, will take an ID first and last. And this ID equals ID, this at first equals first, and this at last equals last. Pretty straightforward, kind of boring, but still. Next up, let's do our toString, which will simply return a template string here of this.id. So I'm using the property here. I'm not accessing the private field directly. Colon this first and this last. So here we already have an example of some really awesome ES 2015 features, everything from symbols to classes and template strings. So that's super exciting. Now let's hop over to our user store. I did delete some, I didn't mean for that to still be there. I did delete some of the example code we had in here before because all we're going to do is export a single class. Now, you already did see that, so let's go ahead and type that in and talk about it real fast. I'm going to say import underscore from Lodash. So import, so I'm importing the default value from this library. And again, this library does not use a relative path. It doesn't use a relative path, so when we load it, the module loader has to be aware of the Lodash library. And there's different module loaders will do different things. Some module loaders will require us to say, okay, you want Lodash, then I'm going to give you this specific file. Then we can point it to what file we want it to load it from. Or other module loaders might say, well, I'm going to get this straight out of your node modules or your Bower directory because they're more intelligent and able to actually read the file system to know how to load modules. So we'll see how this gets compiled in different module loaders as we move along. Next, I'm going to go ahead and create a private field for users. So this users equals symbol users. And then I'll go ahead and create a public property for users so we can get the list of users. So this at users. And I'm going to say .slice. So I'm returning our private field, and then I'm invoking slice on it. Now what slice is going to do is it's going to create a copy of this array. So that's exactly what we want, because we don't want to return the array object. We don't want to return our private field. If we returned our private field, then other people can manipulate the user's array from the user store, and that's not what we want. We want everything to be as read-only as possible. Next up, we'll do our constructor, which will simply initialize our user's private field, and it's simply going to be an array, not surprising. And it's going to be an array of users, also not surprising. And we'll put in just a couple example users. Next up, we'll do an add with a takes 2 parameters, first and last. We're gonna generate a new ID, and the ID we're gonna generate is gonna be the max ID in our users array plus 1. So I'm gonna say next ID equals underscore max. This, and I'm not going to use the property users because that will create a copy of our users array. So I'm going to access the field directly by using this at users, and then pass in u goes into uid, dot ID plus 1. So the max function is going to take an array as the first parameter. The second parameter is going to select which property we want to get the max of, and then it'll return that object, and then we'll do dot ID plus 1. Next up, we'll say const user equals new user, passing in next ID for the ID, first and last for the first and last names, and then I'll push it into our internal database here, and then I'll return it. Next up, let's do remove. It'll accept an ID, and this will simply use the low-remove function. Again, do not do this .users. Do this at users because we want to access the private field. And then we're going to do u.uid equals ID. So we're going to find an object that matches this predicate, and it's going to be removed from the array. All right, that's our user store. You can now imagine seeing the user store go out and hit a database or hit a web service, for example, to get this data back. Generally speaking, the add and remove should return promises so that we can perform an asynchronous operation, but I'm not going to worry about that in this video. Next up, I'm going to show off some new import syntax. So over in the lib folder, I'm going to create a new file called constants, constants.js, and I'm going to say export let application name equals user list. So this is a way we can export a single value. Well, the idea of the constants module would be that we would declare a bunch of constants here that we can use throughout the application. In this case, I'm just doing one, and I'm calling it application name. All right, next up, let's do our users controller. So our users controller is where most of the logic is going to be. The users controller is a function, and it's a default function, that takes an amount and a user store. Mount being the position in the DOM, in the HTML page, that we want to mount this controller onto. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do my imports. I'm going to import jQuery. And I'm also going to do something fun here. I'm going to import jQuery -UI. Now, this is interesting. So this is how you'll generally import plugin type things, more traditional JavaScript files that might not export anything directly or return anything, but instead what they'll do is they'll attach onto an existing object that's been defined. Now, fortunately for us, jQuery and jQuery UI are both AMD compatible. If you wanted to import something that wasn't AMD compatible, you would have to kind of play around with your module loader a little bit and tell it about that non-AMD or non-common JS or non-system JS compatible module and how to load it. In this case, all the module loaders we're going to use will be AMD compatible, so we can go ahead and just import jQuery UI directly, and that'll just basically superpower our little jQuery object with all the jQuery UI plugins. This is typically how you would import a jQuery plugin or a moment plugin or whatever. Also note, so that actually brings up an interesting thing. We might have many files in our project, many modules, that import both jQuery and jQuery UI. Now, generally, all of our module loaders, when it sees multiple imports throughout different modules in your system, will only import those dependencies once. So it's important that our modules all load the things that we want to be loaded in. But our module loaders will not repeatedly request for that module to be loaded after it's been loaded once. Now that can potentially cause bugs. For example, if I had imported this jQuery UI properly here, jQuery UI will have kind of added itself to the jQuery object. So now in another file that gets loaded after user's controller, if it imports just jQuery, it'll have access to all the jQuery UI functions on it. So if this module runs first, and then a second module imports jQuery, that jQuery object returned by the second module will be the same jQuery object here, and the same object that got added, jQuery UI added to it. The The reason that can be a problem is, let's say that second module uses jQuery UI functions, but doesn't declare a dependency on jQuery UI, and then somehow the module loading order changes, then your build will break. Because it, in the past, this jQuery UI would have already been loaded, so it didn't need to be loaded again. But if the module loading order changes, well, then it's no longer loaded and you'll get a runtime error. So for that reason, load in all of your dependencies and all of your plugins for all of your dependencies for every module you need. Now, don't get too terrified about that. Generally speaking, if you keep your modules short and to the point, you won't have a bunch of import statements. If you start finding you do have a bunch of import statements, that is an indication to break your module up into more modules. Anyway, little rant over there. Let's go ahead and implement our users controller. The first thing I'm going to do is say mount.empty. So I'm going to clear out every single thing in whatever DOM element was passed in. A mount is going to be a jQuery object pointing to an element on our page, and user store is obviously going to be an instance of the user store. Note that I did not import user store from the user store module, even though I'm expecting to get an object of this type. So note that difference. Module loading has no bearing on what objects you can use. It has no real runtime consequences. So we can request an object, or not request an object, but have a parameter of an object that's of type user store, even if we don't import it, as long as the thing that invokes this function does import the user store and properly instantiates it. All right, then I'm going to say const parent, and I'm going to go ahead and say open up jQuery, and then I'm going to write a template string, because template strings allow me to do multi-line strings. I'm going to create class users controller, a div here. I'll do an h1 here. In the h1, I want to go ahead and pull in that application name object, or that application name constant. So I'm going to say import application name from lib util. So I'm just importing that nice little constant from that file, from that module. So let's go ahead and use it there. Then I'm going to create a ul class equals list, or how about users list? And then I'll create an ahref hash with a class of add user and some text of add user. Then I'm going to go ahead and, after I create this this DOM element, I'm going to go ahead and append it to my mount node. Then I'm going to extract out references to my UL and my A. So I'm going to say const user list equals parent.find users list. And then I'm going to say add user button equals parent find add user. All right, so after that, let's go ahead and create a function that's responsible for creating a user row. So not surprisingly, it's going to be called create user row, and it's going to accept a user object. And what it's going to do is it's going to create a new li on this ul. So I'm going to say const row equals money li, and then I'm going to say dot text is user.toString, and then I'm going to say dot click. So every time we click a user row, it's going to invoke this function. And then after that, we're going to say dot append to user list. Now, for its click handler is simply going to say money div title equals confirm. And then are you sure for the content? And then I'm going to invoke the dialog method, which comes as a part of jQuery UI. So I'm going to pass in modal is true, and then I'm going to pass in for buttons, I'm going to pass in an object with delete as a button and cancel as another button. So delete is simply going to say money this dot, user store delete user.id. Remember, user is the parameter being passed into this function. And then I want to remove the row, so row remove, and then I want to close the dialog. So this dialog close. And then for cancel, it'll simply say this dialog close. And that's it. So that's our create user row. I'll also want to go ahead and return the row. So at the end of the function, I'm going to say return money row. Now let's go ahead and add a click handler to our add user button. So I'm going to say add user button dot click, and it's going to accept a E for the event. I'm going to say e.prevent default, and then I'm going to say create user row, and I'm going to pass in user store.add first last. So users store. So I'm invoking user store.add, which will create a new user object and add it to the internal database. And then I'm invoking create user row with that new user. So every time you click this button, you'll get a new user in the list. Then I'm going to say dot append to, and I'm going to append it to parent. I don't like this indentation. There we go. That looks a lot better. And yeah. And I could go ahead, we'll not use this function, but I could go ahead and show you guys an example of how you could return a public API for this controller. So I can return a object that has a destroy method that simply says parent.remove. I mean, maybe this would have been better as a class and not a function that returns another object, but I kind of wanted to show exporting default functions, so that's why we're doing it this way. But it really doesn't matter either way. Hey guys, it is Future Nelson here with some errata. So pardon the interruption, but we're going to fix up this file real fast because I was doing this off of memory. There's a couple small bugs with this, and I want to go ahead and fix them before we move on. If you caught those errors, awesome. If you didn't, that's awesome too, because, well, I didn't. So let's go ahead and really quickly fix these problems. First problem is we are not enumerating over our existing users from the user store and invoking the create user row for everything. So if we started this application, which we'll do in the next video, we won't get any existing users. Second of all, we are not selecting, or rather I'm not selecting the proper class names. I'm not using the dot selector to grab these. Remember, the jQuery.find method does a CSS selector, and this is an element selector because there's no period in front of it. And then finally, I used the wrong method name here. The user store method is remove, not delete. So let's just really quickly fix those before we move on. So I'm going to import Lodash. I'm going to say import underscore from Lodash. And then I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to add the dot to both of these selectors. So they're now class selectors, and we'll select the appropriate elements. I'm going to come down here and change delete to remove. And then finally, I'm going to come down here to after add user button, I'm going to say Lodash each users store dot users u goes into create user row u. And that's it. Those are just 3 minor errors that we have in this application. So once we get this application running in the next video, everything will work out awesome. Sorry for the interruption, and carry on. All right, so that's our users controller. Let's go ahead and implement our application.js. So I'm going to come down here to application.js, and I'm going to import user store from user store. I'm going to change this import to users controller. I'm going to remove the, well, I'll keep in the import to util, and I'll keep in this import to script, and I'll do a console log loading application so that when we start loading this up, we can see some feedback. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'll create the new store. Oh, this is users store, isn't it? Create the new store, and then I'm simply going to say const mount equals money mount. So I'm grabbing the mount node from our HTML page, and then I'm going to say users controller, passing in the mount node and the store, and that's it. So that is our JavaScript. Now, some of our module loaders are going to allow us to actually load CSS as well as JavaScript, which is a really interesting feature. But what I want to go ahead and do is, I guess in the next video, we'll go ahead and write some less to style our application so that when we get to loading our modules, we can see examples of how to deal with styles as well as scripts. So we'll see you guys in the next video.